I'm okay. I'm okay. I'm doing good. How are you?
I'm all right. I'm hanging in there. Just working away. So I some question because to me you're mostly an internet personality, and I've read your blog many times. I have all these like side questions about the life of the Daniel. So I guess the first silly question on my mind is like why choose the name in Discord circles, Darth Van Til? Don't you think that that's gonna don't you think that that's gonna cause people to think of you as like Darth Dawkins or something like that?
uh, no, it's kind of funny. I chose the name solely because of Vincent. No, Vincent is like Darth Bonson, so I just said, oh, okay,
Oh, he started a
yeah,
trend. Okay, I got it. I was like, I don't understand.
yeah. So,
That actually makes perfect sense, and I'm not sure why I didn't see that. Okay.
yeah, so there was a time I think his name was something else, and I also had a name similar to that. So I don't know. I just tried to piss him off a little bit.
I got you. Okay. Following the trend, following the trend. Uh, so what are you doing right now, Daniel? Are you in school? Are you working? Is it both? What is give us a little
Yeah,
info about like what goes on in your life? What gets you into philosophy and theology?
yeah. So I'm currently in school. I'm a student. I'm studying computer science at school over here in Nigeria. So in my spare time, I write on my blog and I study philosophy and theology and things of that nature.
That's interesting. So that's reminiscent of like James Anderson, I think, because I think he was supposed to be a computer science major at one point, computer science
Oh yeah, yeah,
major.
yeah. Yeah, that's right.
What are you planning to do with computer science? Where are you going with that?
Well, in general, I'm thinking of um, I like games a lot, so probably game design and development and of that sort. Lord willing.
Cool. You know what's funny? When
Yeah.
I was in college, so I went to Biola for a year, and when I dropped out of Biola, I went back to school for a little bit to try to be a computer science major, and it's just the sort of mathematical mind that computer science majors
Yeah.
have for the language part of it is above me. That's just not my it's not my
Uh,
skill set. But I find that interesting because my main goal at that time was, I really want to make a video game. So that's interesting to me. It must be like a common. I wonder
yeah.
how common that is among Vantillians.
It's probably I don't know, but yeah, it's pretty cool.
Nice. Uh, what? So, as people probably ask you how you became a Vantillian, or I bet you even more common get the question, well, why? Why are you a Vantillian? Like, how could you believe this question begging point of view? But I'm really more interested, like, how did you become a Christian? Like, what did you grow up in a family household that was Christian, or maybe you could tell us like your story about.
Well, yeah, I've been a Christian all my life. So I was born and raised a Christian. My parents are really devoted Christians. They're pastors. Like my dad's a pastor, so I was raised in church, and I grew up. Everything I knew was this Christian outlook, and so that's why that's how I became a Christian. I was raised that way.
Very cool. What kind of did you grow up Reformed, or was that something that you developed later on?
But that was something I developed later on. My parents, they're a bit I guess you call it Pentecostal or charismatic. So
Okay.
that's yeah, that's a tradition I grew up in. But later on, I picked up on the Reformed tradition. So
I hear you.
yeah.
That's interesting. Do you are you still I don't were you ever or are you still a continuationist or is that just on your parents and you've kind of moved on quite a bit from their theology?
Well, I okay. I would say I'm still a continuationist. Yeah, I would say I am still a continuationist. Although I may not be as, should I say, extreme as some other charismatics, but I'm still sympathetic towards continuationism. Yeah.
Cool. Interesting. What would you say sparked your Reformation, your movement into that theological bloodline?
To the Reformed tradition,
Yeah.
yeah, I'd say it'll be mostly my study in apologetics first. So when I
Interesting.
yeah, when I started studying apologetics, I started out as a kind of a William Lane Craig fanboy. So I yeah, so I listened to a lot of his debates. I read a lot of his articles and still things like that. So I was full blown classical and evidentialist. But I stumbled onto, I think it was Matt Slick. So I stumbled. That was my first encounter with whatever with what is called the tag, right, the transcendental argument for God. So that was my first introduction into that. So the more I studied, then I became more and more. So when I became like a full blown Vancilian, and I discovered that this method is really rooted in a very peculiar theological viewpoint. I just, my belief system just started changing little by little, and that's how I became reformed in that sense.
I hope you hold on to that story, Daniel, because I think there's a lot of people, especially in the Reformed tradition, who maybe hold to a more stark view of common grace and its role in evangelical conversations, especially argument and the more philosophical side of things, who do not think of apologetics. Maybe a lot of them don't even think of it as a legitimate field, but those who do maybe see it as extremely limited and not really maybe it's just there to sort of comfort or assure Christians, and they don't think of it as really kind of an outworking of your theological scheme. So much so that someone like you could go start reading about apologetics, and your entire theology is from the Reformed standpoint becoming more biblical. That's a really interesting counterexample to a certain attitude that
Yeah,
runs in the church.
yeah. I guess you could say that. Yeah.
What was what is it like? So I've never been outside the states. I've never been to Africa. What is it like growing up as a Christian in Nigeria? I take it you've always been in Nigeria. I don't actually know what you're.
Yeah, yeah, I have. Well, it's the I would say the climate here is quite different. That is the religious climate here is quite different than from what I observed in places like maybe the States or the UK. So because Nigeria is very, very, very religious in that sense. So there are Christianity is probably the major religion, but there's also there are parts of the country particularly the northern parts where um, Islam is the major religion, but in general, it's a very religious nation. So growing up as a Christian, it's you're surrounded by these beliefs and religious systems, and there are a lot of denominations, and the the most common is the charismatic or the Pentecostal tradition, right? So that's what you grow up with. You grow up with people with similar religious beliefs, and it turns out because it's so religious that there isn't much questioning, like in the sense of atheism or unbelief. So apologetics is a really, 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 really minor field here. So you're just fed this religious worldview, and you grow up with whatever your parents um, believe in that sense. So
What would you say drove you to these kind of theological and philosophical questions? Then, why you? Right? I mean, what is what?
uh, okay, I would say it started on the internet, right? So on Facebook, I I had a couple of friends who started questioning the Christian system, the Christian worldview, and things like that. And at the point, I was quite young. Well, I am still young, but I was younger. So I was trying to answer them to the best of my abilities, and it's I it seemed there were some questions that I was finding it quite difficult to answer, and so that's when I started studying studying apologetics,
Yeah,
and yeah,
I take it that, and it wasn't long after that that you ran into like William Lane Craig because of his
it wasn't long at all.
yeah.
Yeah,
That's really interesting to me. For me, like listening to this, it's very relatable. I can't even imagine how many Christians have gone through a stage where there's like a conversation that you're trying to have with someone who has different beliefs, and you're trying to convince them. You go and look for means of persuasion, arguments, proofs, whatever, and you run into William Lane Craig, and then you go through that stage, where he's your homeboy and you're using all his arguments. Actually, I went
yeah,
to Biola precisely because I was so drawn to. I like watched William Lane Craig's debates, and I was like, oh man, I want to be that. I want to be the guy on stage, like debating these atheists. So there's even like a little bit of vanity there. But yeah,
yeah,
that's
yeah. That's
so.
true.
Where would you place yourself then after like growing up in this very religious climate, and you get into apologetics and you get to the point where you run into Van Til. Actually, why don't let me interrupt myself. How did you find Van Til through Matt Slick? I mean, obviously you ran into the tag, and I'm imagining that you found Matt Slick through Carm, his website.
Yeah, yeah, I did.
That's
So
Go ahead,
yeah,
go ahead.
yeah. So I ran into, well, technically there was a certain website. I can't remember the name, but I think it had these apologetics resources and links and stuff like that, but it was mostly presuppositional, although I didn't really know what it was at the time. So I saw Transcendental Argument for God. I was like, okay. So I clicked the link, and it took me to Matt Slick's website, and I read the argument, and I was like, huh, this sounds really good. Like, logic. So logic can prove God. That's so rhetorically powerful, right? So for a period, that was my go-to argument. So I used it a lot
Yeah.
in internet discussions with atheists and stuff like that. So the more I employ the argument, the more I used it in these discussions. There were certain probably objections and responses that I probably didn't know how to answer. That's when I started studying more, and on that, the original website that linked Matt Slick's website, there was also a section about a person named Greg Bonson, and it was said that it was like a man that atheists feared the most, and I was like, what? So it was a link to Bonson's debate with Gordon Stein, and when I listened to that debate, that's that's probably when the light bulbs went up. Like, oh, all right, this is the real stuff. This is the good stuff. So
Interesting.
yeah.
Very interesting. Who would you say
So from
once? Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
yeah, so from then on, it was like a chain reaction. So from Bonson, I got I got to know about Van Til, then I got to know about the Choosing Hats blog. So that's when I became a full blown Van Tilian.
Nice. So that makes me very curious. What was there like a particular moment or event or argument that where you can say, "Hey, this is really where I started thinking like a Calvinist," or "Hey, this is where I really came to affirm the doctrines of grace," or something like that.
Well, I I don't think I'll be able to pinpoint a specific moment or an argument. I think it's something that occurred over time as I studied these things more, especially as I studied Fantilianism. So I just became probably I found myself affirming more and more of these doctrines. You know,
I got you. Yeah,
yeah,
like slow movement to be more consistent with what you had been persuaded of in apologetics.
yeah, exactly.
Interesting. So once you got into, once you threw Carm and well, you found Carm through this other website, but once you started using this argument and were searching around and ran into Van Til and especially through Bonson, Bonson has such a particular um, what's the word? His particular flair of Van Tilianism, and that reminds me that there are kind of very different flares depending on who you go to. Who would you relate to most as a Van Tilian? Who would you say is like the most you line up with um, on how you go about arguing, how you go about constructing your theology?
Well, if you had asked me this question probably maybe even a year ago or maybe 2 years ago, I would have probably said Bonson. But now I'd say I'd line up more with Van Til since
Yeah,
I feel I feel he's the the real essence of the presuppositional method. Of course, Bonson is really close, but I feel Van Til, the way he thinks, and maybe it's probably the continental flavor of his thought. I just feel,
yeah.
okay, yeah, yeah.
So for someone listening who's not maybe familiar with that, with what you're insinuating and with what you just explicitly said, this continental flavor, how would you clarify that for people who are maybe new to this topic?
Okay, so yeah, in philosophy, there's the analytic tradition and there's the continental tradition. So the analytic tradition is like what's um, most of contemporary philosophy is about, right? So it's mostly about these analysis of very particular different topics in philosophy. So they split them up and analyze everything in detail, right? But it's holistic in a way, and they deal with more holistic issues. And if if we're going to classify it by probably geography, the continental thinkers were more in Europe. People like Kant and probably Wittgenstein and yeah, the idealist. So, but the analytic, probably the Western and the American nowadays. So that continental flavor is what that holistic thinking of philosophy in terms of a comprehensive quest to find the nature of reality, right? So we think about it comprehensively as a whole, like the whole of human experience. That's 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 the influence. That tradition influenced Van Til and his thoughts because of the whole is the idealism and Kant and everything. So
Yeah, it's
that's
funny. It's funny as you're saying all this. I'm thinking in the back of my mind. There's um, a lot of commenters on this on these words. Continental and analytic will complain that it's not a very clear divide. It's not a clean cut divide because there are people, across the pond.
mhm,
Some Americans say who are very analytic in their thinking. I think of like Wittgenstein as like a really good example of someone who, or the Vienna Circle, right? It's like the logical positivists. These are excellent examples of like the roots, the maybe like first exemplars of what we now in contemporary philosophy think of as analytic. But they're not.
yeah,
They're very much not American. They're not British.
yeah,
But um, then you went to reference Kant, and it's maybe the easy takeaway for people who are trying to remember the terms is like, hey, continental Kant, because yeah, I mean he's huge, huge influence in this what you're just calling here like holistic thinking, the system building way of doing
yeah.
philosophy. So that's funny to me. Like, yeah, it's not really a clear cut divide, but who would you say besides if you had to pick someone besides Van Til? Because I think it's interesting that you do pick him. I want to come back to that, but if you had to pick someone other than Van Til, who are some, and maybe not even in apologetics, but who would you say are some good theological influences that made you think more reformed, more um, uh, revelationally about the world, about your experience?
Well, apart from Van Til, I read a lot of um well obviously there are still reformed or presuppositional thinkers like people like I think Dr. Chris Bolt was a huge influence on my journey in apologetics and theology. So when it comes, I'd like to think of myself as an analytical continental thinker, if that's a thing, right? So I feel Van Til influenced me to think more like a continental philosopher, right? And I'd say Dr. Chris was more like okay, the analytic part. So since he has a PhD and things like that, so he was an influence. Also, I James Anderson. Yeah, so there was a point where I was really hooked on Dr. Anderson. So he really influenced me a lot. Also, even though I disagree with him on a couple of things now, but he was still a huge influence. And I also mentioned yourself, Jimmy Stevens. Like, yeah, I learned a lot from reading your posts on the council website and even on Discord. So there was that too.
That's ironic. What would you say? You mentioned this disagreement with Bonson, and that's interesting to me because you say there's almost you point out like a movement in your thought where you can look back and say, I got into this because of Bonson, but now I think of myself as more Vantilian, and that's very interesting to me because I too feel that way about where I've come in my thoughts. So I'm curious to see how you would explain that, how you would comment on that.
Oh well, I wouldn't say okay. I still agree with Bonson on a lot of things, right? So I think he he's still a Vantilian through and through. I just feel um he's a bit I want to phrase this correctly, but okay, let me say Van Til is like these this dense and concentrated is like the strong drink, right? By Bonson is a bit more diluted, so it's a bit easier to drink. So, but Van Til is kind of more concentrated and quite strong. So I feel in my thought, there are some things in Van Til that you don't find in Bonson, but um, Bonson helped me understand Van Til and think about things better. But so when I study Van Til, I there are a lot of should I say hidden gems, right, that you can just pick out and analyze and say like, this guy was he really knew his stuff, right? So that's how I cash it out because so Bonson is quite he's good, but when I read Van Til, when I study themes that Van Til talks about, I get a better view of what exactly this reformed apologetics is about.
I see. I see. You're going straight to the source. What would you do? Does an example come to mind of like a place where you feel um, you're just not getting the dense drink with Bonson? You're getting something that's too derivative or something like that.
Okay, okay. For example, Van Til in a lot of his writings stressed the concept of an absolute God, right? So the absolute God of Christian theism is the precondition of our experience. So Van Til stressed a lot on the absolute God and how he relates to reality and this and the arguments that Van Til gives for this God and the ways in which he criticizes the unbelieving worldviews that reject this God. There is a kind of difference with what Bonson gives. So perhaps Bonson might refer to things like maybe he had his big three: the uniformity of nature, logic, and morality, right? So when he debates or in more of his popular works, he refers to those. But even in his maybe not so popular level works, he might talk about the the problem of brute facts and things of that nature. But Van Til, when he goes into concepts like the rational irrational dialectic, the issue of pure contingency, of abstract possibility, things of that nature that you don't hear in Bonson. So those concepts are really integral to his thoughts and to his arguments for Christian theism. So the more I study that, the better I can understand even what Bonson is trying to argue. So that's an example.
That's a good example. You bring up the absolute, and that makes me thirsty for a topic that you've wanted to talk about for a while. I think now, which is like the question, kind of the question: what does it mean? What does it mean for God to be absolute? But also how that relates to more traditional questions of God's attributes. What would you say? Um, if someone were to ask you, what does it mean to say God is absolute? How would you answer that question?
Yeah, so this is something I was thinking about recently. So I'd say to be absolute is um to be the highest, to be the most ultimate. That's how put that's how I'd simply put it, right? So there's nothing higher, there's nothing more ultimate, there's nothing more fundamental than this being. There's no that there isn't a higher standard or principle. So this being is absolute, right? And being absolute implies certain other attributes like being self-contained and self-sufficient. So that's basically how I say what it means to be absolute.
Yeah. So it's interesting to me because um, similar to what I think is the more intuitive view in the West, maybe not in every philosophy, certainly not globally, but especially influenced by Plato and Aristotle, the Western philosophies of the world seem to find foundationalism and epistemology more intuitive. The way you're talking about metaphysics here, the way you're talking about our view of reality, is very hegemonous, right? It's very hierarchical. When you say it's the ultimate thing, I'm picturing in my mind here. Okay, there's kind of like um, authority in reality. There's kind of a derivation of things that are in control versus things that are in control over them, and things that are in control over them, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's it, right? So that's actually what I was thinking about these past few days, because Van Til usually he used the phrase like a God that is surrounded by abstract possibility, and I thought about it a bit and was like, okay, yeah. So if God is not thought of as absolute, like as the most ultimate being, metaphysical principle, whatever, there must be something else that is more fundamental than God, and in that sense, he ceases to be absolute. So there's always a hierarchy in reality. For the Christian, God is the highest. For the non-Christian, it might be bare possibility or maybe some abstract principle of time or of eternity or whatever.
So, in my experience, I love that. In my experience, the pushback you face in making a dilemma like that, you've either got God at the top or something else, is not, of course, normally that somebody wants to say it's something else, but that somebody wants to say, well, why can't it be God and some such the
Uh,
top, and they won't even word it that way, right? Like I'm thinking of planting as view of modality, maybe, right? That's just so common in Christian thought to think of like possible to think of God in terms of um, a system of possibility, necessity, or something like that. What would you? How would you help clarify this concept of God as absolute, so that someone can really see, hey, there's no way to get around that dilemma. There's no way to have, both and God and something else at the top, so to speak.
So yeah, I know there's a lot of most of the time people will try to posit some other, and they might not do this intentionally, but they might posit some other ultimate tool alongside God. It may be abstract objects or whatever. What I'd say to that is I'd argue that there cannot be two absolutes, right? So if there is a principle or if there are metaphysical objects or principles that are alongside God at the top, but which are distinct from God, which are outside his control, then God cannot be absolute, because to be absolute you have to be self-sufficient, right? Self-contained. You don't need anything outside you. But if there is another principle which is also at the top, then that principle or that being could exert influence on reality, right? And this influence which this ultimate principle also exerts on reality would influence God, right? So God may have to look outside himself to maintain his nature or his essence or things like that. So if there is some other principle alongside God, then they will have to be mutually dependent, which destroys the entire concept of absolute of an absolute God.
That's very good. One of the questions we were talking about in private messages was about this absoluteness and sort of how it lines up with his attributes. And I think that you want to say something about the singularity or the derivative nature of God's attributes with respect to his absoluteness. How would you put that?
So this is another thing that I was thinking about recently, because I just thought about the the concept of an absolute God, right? What it entails. So first of all, he has to be self-contained, right, and self-sufficient. Nothing external to him can influence his being, right? So that gives us self-containment and self-sufficiency. But an absolute God must also be transcendent, right? Must be truly transcendent, because if he exists on the same metaphysical plane as us humans, then he ceases to be absolute, because he would then have to be subject the constraints, uh, to the same constraints as man. So an absolute God must be transcendent and he must be all knowing, because if he weren't, then that destroys his self sufficiency and his absolute nature. And an absolute God must also be in sovereign control of reality. Because if there were aspects of reality which he which were not under his control, then he would have to consult those aspects in order to, like, augment his knowledge and things like that. So he must be in control of reality and he must have exhaustive foreknowledge of whatever facts may occur. So his knowledge must be constructive of reality. So it seems all God's attributes just seem to flow from the idea that He is absolute, right? So that's how I think about it. But and an absolute God must also be personal, because there's the argument that I think you and probably Chris Matthew, I've seen you guys make, that uh, a God who's just one person, like a Unitarian God, cannot be personal or loving or absolute, because he would have to depend on his creation in order to exhibit, in order to actualize some of his attributes, right? So, so he must be personal, and he must also be Trinitarian. So we're just describing the Christian God already. So if God is absolute, then it follows that he's also transcendent, omniscient, all powerful, and the like. So that's how I thought about it.
Yeah, that's good. Do you think so? Do you think that someone reasoning about these things can conclude Christianity? Say we were talking about a very philosophically inclined Native American. You know, here I'm speaking of. I'm not speaking of just those people born in America, but obviously um, the um, pagans who were here prior to Christians coming over the sea. Do you think that there could be Christians here because of arguments like these? Could someone think about God and start to deduce all these things about his attributes and so on and so forth? What's your take on that?
Well, I don't think so, because okay, if a philosophically inclined Native American first start thinking about these things, I'd feel he would end up with a kind of abstract concept God, because even though he might have all the attributes, the God we believe in is a God that has acted in history and revealed himself, a God that has condescended. He, a, a God that, a concrete being, right? So, but what we get from this abstract analysis is just a concept of deity, which we don't know whether or not he has acted in history or revealed himself. So, such a person may get some of the things right, but he would still not arrive at the full Christian concept of God. That's what I think about it, because special revelation is necessary to understand the Christian concept of God.
How would you make that a persuasive case? Like if somebody were talking to you about this stuff and wonders, uh, why believe that this absolute must be part of human history? Why am I not sufficient philosophically with my idea of God untouched by the realm of history, except for my thoughts about him?
Uh, well, I think I wrote an article on my blog recently about this very thing. Like, if we can know about a God purely through reason and logic and abstract analysis, then that God cannot be absolute, because he would have to be comprehensible. Because in in what we've done, even in our analysis of an absolute God and all the attributes that flow from it, we haven't still even grasped 1% of how God actually is, right? Because he's incomprehensible. Whatever we're saying about him is what he has revealed to us in a way we can understand, right? But if unaided by revelation, man is able to deduce everything about a certain being, then that being is comprehensible and must exist on the same level, on the same metaphysical level as man. So that's what I'd say, because unaided by revelation, all you end up with is a finite God.
That's really good. I notice this pattern to me that is maybe like the most keystone Vantilian trait of argument, of reasoning. It's this pattern of basically reasoning that God can't be a creature, that he has to hold the status of creator, he has to be the uncreated one. And so any kind of thought that would reduce him, to use your language, down to our metaphysical plane is problematic. And the irony is that it seems to me, you're using the same kind of reasoning with respect to God's attributes as when you reason about revelation. So before you were reasoning, hey, if God's not absolute, if he's not self-sufficient, and presumably we would add to that the other collection of God's perfections, his immutability, his triunity, etc., etc. If God is not these things, he ends up being a creature. He ends up being not absolute. But that's very ironically the same kind of reasoning you're using with Revelation. You're saying, hey, look, if we were able to deduce God, if we were able to just appeal to our own faculties of reason and experience and so forth to somehow access what God is really like, he would be a creature. He would have to be defined by human experience and all these other things. And so
Yeah,
that's very curious to me, because I think of, to me, like maybe the like the William Lane Craig of Reformed theology is maybe someone like R.C. Sproul, and that's very different than you see a self-proclaimed classicalist like Sproul arguing, right? Like for non-Vantilians, the way to argue about Scripture, the way to argue about revelation, especially special revelation, is very different. You almost have to kind of abandon the theological scheme you were using in systematics and move to a very different way of reasoning when you touch history. But for you, there's kind of this underlying pattern, and you may have a bunch of different arguments to offer, right? I'm not saying you don't, but there's this underlying pattern of this sort of wisdom that, hey, one big problem that stands in the way of these other philosophical views is that they pretend to get to God straight from reason, and you're using the same argument you just did for God's absoluteness, for God's immanence, for his accessibility in history. That's fascinating to me.
yeah. So, yeah, I noticed that too. But that's just the way we have to think about these things, right?
Right. Yeah.
So,
The summary for that, I guess, is the creature creator distinction. That has been huge in Van Til.
yeah,
Um,
right.
did you maybe want to put forward your contention about God's the singularness of his attributes, or is that still something you're cooking on?
It's still something I'm thinking about, but basically what I was thinking was, if these attributes flow from the fact that God is absolute, then if we say that, okay, God is absolute personality, right? Have we not just described what he is essentially? Like, all these attributes are just a way of us saying that God is absolute personality. So that's basically what was on my mind. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
I guess the I as far as the statements that God's attributes are entailed by his absoluteness, I think that's really drawing from the same reformed belief. And to me, it's really kind of a basic thing I think most Christians take for granted, even if they're not consciously aware of it. Even if they deny it in philosophy because they aren't self-conscious enough. And that thing they take for granted is that God's attributes are mutually entailing, right? God, so perfect is he can only be the way he is. There's no real way to conceive of him except the way he's presented himself. And of course, the way he presents himself to us can only be the way it is. He can only be faithful and true to himself. And so, to that extent, when you say something like self-containedness or omniscience or his triune personhood are entailed by his absoluteness, I don't think there's that. To me seems like you're going to run into really big issues if you deny it. But the thing I wanted to poke you about was the idea that there's maybe some kind of metaphysical priority to God's absoluteness, because that to me might be problematic. The idea that like his triunity or his immutability, say, metaphysically derive from this prior state or attribute of being absolute.
Oh, okay. I understand what you mean, but no, I don't think I'm not saying that. Obviously, obviously, I don't think God's absoluteness is prior to perhaps his other attributes. What I'd say is possibly maybe his absoluteness just is his omniscience or his omnipotence or things of that nature. So basically, there are just when we say he's transcendent or self-contained, or we're just we're just trying to, in our own creaturely way, right? We're trying to capture just one single, the essence of God, like the way he is. So when we say he's absolute or transcendent or omniscient, we're just using different human categories to capture one singular essence or one singular attribute. So perhaps that's what I'd say.
That's interesting. Okay, you remove my fun. You spoil my fun because I wanted to argue. No, I'm just kidding. No, but that's interesting. You say capture. So this kind of gets into the simplicity issue. I mean, I wonder what you think about simplicity in general, but then also more particularly, how would you cash out God's attributes? Because on the one hand, it seems like you're saying there's this multifariousness to God. He's has we have multiple statements about God that we don't take to have identical meaning, but then um, you're saying, hey, each time we say this, we're kind of capturing one thing. We're capturing this absoluteness.
Mm, yeah. Well, okay. I admit that perhaps I haven't studied as much as I like to about the doctrine of divine simplicity, but with regards to the absoluteness, and I just say it boils down to the incomprehensibility of God, right? And the fact that as humans, we must think discretely, right? We must think in parts. And so the way I'd probably harmonize that is to say, like I said, that even though God perhaps is one being, like is a simple being in essence, when we try to predicate about God and his attributes, we cannot help but talk about it discreetly and perhaps talk about his omniscience. Then another time we talk about his transcendence and things like that, because it maybe perhaps it's just a consequence of our human finitude, right? So, and the fact that we have to think discreetly, but God in himself. is singular and simple and just one essential being, right?
Yeah, it's good. Um, Daniel, maybe so I'll have to wrap this up pretty soon, but maybe you can tell us a little bit about your book, and we can try to get some people to start reading it.
Okay. Yeah, so the book it's titled "The Folly of Unbelief," right? So I started writing it last year, December last year. So basically, I just wanted to lay out my thoughts on what exactly are the philosophical arguments that I'd launch against unbelieving the system of autonomy in general. So that's what birthed the book, right? And basically, the biblical motivation is the different passages where the Bible talks about how there's a philosophy that's according to Christ and one that's not according to Christ, and the philosophy that according to Christ is wise and the other one ends in foolishness, and how Scripture always presents this antithesis between belief and unbelief, and how Scripture talks about the fool and how the unbeliever it ends up in darkness and futility of thought. So that's basically the biblical motivation for what I spell out philosophically. So it's basically that's the that's the entire motivation, and I book is split into 5 parts, right?
Y-
So I basically yeah
you also have a primer out right now, a little free thing that for anyone to get.
yeah. So that one is a little bit of a side project I worked on. So it's called I Am, Therefore I Think, right? So a little play on Rene Descartes' dictum, right? So there I argue how God is the precondition of human thinking. So so basically we cannot think unless we have revelation from God and unless God exists. So that's what I argue in that little 20 pages and or thereabout.
Very cool. Yeah, I like you have good what are these called, subtitles? Not subtitles. I can't think of what this is called, but your book is labeled "The Folly of Unbelief: Philosophical Illustrations of the Futility of Unbelieving Thought." That to me is very. I look forward to seeing what's in here because there's a lot of abstract and philosophical dealings with Van Til and revelational epistemology and these kind of apologetic encounters. But it's harder to find, in my opinion, it's hard to find concrete stuff. It's harder to find good examples, ways to start seeing how people really encounter what you're calling the antithesis in daily life. So I really look forward to seeing how you can draw that out of scripture and, like your subtitle says, illustrate how this is kind of a universal paradigm. It's kind of a universal piece uh, of human experience. That's really cool.
So,
Yeah,
oh, go ahead.
yeah,
No, Daniel, go ahead.
yeah. So basically, that was pretty much my aim, right? So to bring all these arguments and put them in one place, like what exactly is Van Til talking about? Like what exactly are his arguments for what he's saying, right? But even though just a little trivia is I don't even mention Van Til or Bonson throughout the book, but the ideas and the concepts I lay out were gleaned from Van Til's thought. So I basically put all these philosophical arguments together and showing how autonomy or a rejection of revelational epistemology in general leads to skepticism and subjectivism. So,
So I was wondering, when you surveyed all the precept literature out there, I'm assuming that you said there's a hole out there that your book is filling. Can you kind of explain how it plays its part in the our precept literature? So
okay, yeah. So basically, the literature, most of the literature of the presuppositional apologetic, basically focuses on there are pieces that focus on the methodology itself, right? The theory of how to defend the faith, like um, what exactly neutrality is and the general method we take, right? And there are parts that focus on the central tenets of, let's say, Van Til's thought, perhaps his doctrine of analogy and things like that, of autonomy, and the actual practical and argumentative side is a part that has not been fully developed, in my opinion. I'm not trying to say that um, there are no arguments in the literature. Of course, they are, but I feel the arguments that I lay out in the book are sparsely considered. They are there in Van Til's thought, but they are not fleshed out in the popular literature. So when people think of the transcendental argument, they think of, oh, you can't account for logic or morality, but there are some even more potent arguments that Van Tillian can utilize in his case against unbelief. So that's basically the hole that I'm trying to fill.
Very cool. Okay, I gotta wrap this up. This is a really cool interview. Maybe, but thanks for coming on, Daniel. This is good stuff. I in particular am hungry to see people point out the practical side of Antil. So I'm looking forward to this, man.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Jimmy.